This is an aerial photo of Houston. It's quite literally a nightmare of endless sprawl. And unfortunately, it's come to symbolize what a ton of American cities look like. Just look at LA, Dallas, or Vegas, for example. It's the same thing in different fonts. It's basically slop sprawl. That's right, new word. And before anyone gets mad at me, I literally now live in Phoenix, Arizona, which is the same. But why is this the case? Why are the majority of American cities so terribly designed? Well, there's a common misconception that they were always built around the car, that the highways, suburbia, and complete lack of walkability was inevitable. But that's actually not true. In fact, in the early 20th century, American cities had some of the most extensive streetcar and rail networks in the world. Take South California as a whole, for example. Back in the 1920s, they had the Pacific Electric Railway, better known as the Red Cars, which at that point was the largest electric railway system in the world with over 1,000 miles of track. Organized around the city centers of Los Angeles and San Bernardino, it connected cities in LA County, Orange County, San Bernardino County, and Riverside County. And that was along with the Los Angeles Railway, which primarily served downtown LA with 642 miles of rail. At its peak, they combined to serve an insane 350 million riders a year. Yet today, these public transit systems are nowhere to be seen except for a congested bus network and the LA Metro, which to be fair is actually quite underrated, but it's still a major work in progress, and a massive regression compared to where it should be at. Of course, LA is just one example of this. Detroit had a great streetcar system. Houston did, Atlanta did, Buffalo did. It's the same story all over. By the 1920s, roughly 1,200 streetcar systems operated across the country, with over 44,000 miles of track. It wasn't just big cities, but mid-sized and small towns too. They shaped where people lived, where businesses opened, and where neighborhoods grew. The walkable, mixed-use districts that Americans now pay a premium to live in were the default. So what actually happened? Well, of course, there are a few reasons. We have to go back to the late 19th century, when electrified streetcars were replacing the horse-drawn ones, which quickly became the dominant mode of transportation in many cities. It was a very profitable business, and over time, the businessmen who ran the streetcars, called traction magnates, consolidated multiple lines into monopolies in many cities. Eventually, many of them contracted with city governments for the explicit right to operate as a monopoly in that city. In exchange, they agreed to all sorts of conditions. One particularly damaging requirement was that they held fares constant at 5 cents and mandated that rail line owners maintain the pavement around their tracks, according to Stephen Smith at Market Urbanism. This wasn't a big deal at the time, until the 1910s hit, when the Ford Model T, the first car accessible to the masses, really began to take off. At the beginning of 1908, there were fewer than 200,000 automobiles in the US. By 1916, that number grew to over 2.2 million. Once these cars were on the road, they drive on streetcar tracks, and the streetcars could no longer operate efficiently. There were massive delays, traffic jams, and people weren't happy with the situation. Then, when we look back at the contracts these traction magnates had signed, the sacrifices they made to act as monopolies, especially when they were no longer operating as them, it became an impossible situation. Let me explain. These companies were still locked into 5-cent fares, which didn't keep up with inflation, but streetcars had to get approval from municipal commissions for any fare hikes. And the idea of the 5-cent fare had become ingrained as something of a birthright among much of the public. So they weren't getting approved. But also there was that other obligation, to maintain the pavement around their tracks. So essentially, this meant that these companies were effectively subsidizing automobile travel even as it destroyed their business. And again, paying for this maintenance when you're also locked into a 5-cent fare system is a quick road to bankruptcy, which it inevitably led to. By 1918, roughly half of America's streetcar network was operated by companies that had gone bankrupt. As they fought to stay alive during the Great Depression, many companies chose to invest in buses, and the reasons were quite simple. 1, it was cheaper. 2, it was easier to add new routes, and 3, these single-unit streetcars running in mixed traffic had both the disadvantages of a train, being unable to detour, and the disadvantages of a bus, which had limited capacity. By the end of the 1920s, about 20% of the country's cities used buses only. Now, at this point, I feel like I have to make a quick mention of the conspiracy that General Motors killed the streetcar. Basically, between 1938 and 1950, a company called National City Lines, with investment from General Motors, Firestone Tires, Standard Oil, Phillips Petroleum, and Max Trucks, all companies that would stand to benefit from the death of public transit, bought the streetcar systems in 45 cities across 16 states, dismantled the infrastructure, and pushed the acceleration of the switch to buses. This is undeniably true, but the reality is that this trend was already in motion with or without them. They really just accelerated it, like vultures picking at the remains of a dying system. As I said before, 20% of the country's cities used buses only by the late 1920s, and countless other systems were in the midst of switching over on some routes even earlier. Meanwhile, the ultimate reach of this conspiracy only extended to about 10% of America's transit systems in total, or even less if you consider that the number of American cities with street railways was over 700 in the 1920s. By the mid-1930s, before they made any purchases, there was already one registered car for every 2 US households. The rest of the Western world started getting rid of their streetcars just a couple of decades later. But don't get me wrong, the automobile and oil industry isn't innocent in the grand scheme of things, at all. They're why most US cities prioritize cars over people. For example, the American Automobile Association sponsoring school safety programs, telling children that they must stop before they cross the street and let cars pass. Or the 12 Commandments of Safety they put out in 1925, essentially telling them the street is for cars. This was a new sentiment, one that would be easier to instill in a new, younger generation, assuring a future receptive market. This way, children would grow up with a planted idea of where cars were meant to be in society. And look at point number 11, specifically, don't jaywalk. This also comes from the automobile industry, relying on the idea that it would be more impactful for a person to be ridiculed and judged by their peers. The auto industry began planting the idea that walking wherever you wanted in the streets was stupid, illegal, and unsafe. Auto campaigners lobbied police to publicly shame transgressors and employed the use of whistles and shouting to draw attention to the person instead of quietly correcting them. They also staged safety campaigns where actors dressed as clowns would cross the streets illegally, implying that doing so was foolish. This was an aggressive method of rewriting the narrative around public spaces, and also is how the crime of jaywalking was invented. Then, when auto industry groups took control of a series of meetings convened by then Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover to create a model traffic law that could be used by cities across the country, they ended up with the 1928 Model Municipal Traffic Ordinance, which was influenced by a traffic law in Los Angeles that enacted very strict pedestrian controls, such that pedestrians could only cross at crosswalks and only at right angles. And it's basically the legal foundation for the way American cities still regulate pedestrians today. Later, the media got better at promoting the importance of cars, and was even able to help shift the culture of the entire country to one that emphasized individualism and the freedom of the open road. Car companies invested heavily in advertising campaigns that portrayed the car as an essential tool for achieving the American dream. It became clear that the car was by far winning the transportation argument over public transit. And soon enough, that argument was about to get the biggest boost in American history. On June 29, 1956, President Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act, the largest public works project in American history. It authorized over $25 billion for more than 41,000 miles of interstate highway. But the critical detail was the funding structure: 90% federal, 10% state. The federal government covered 90 cents of every dollar spent on highway construction. There wasn't an equivalent program for transit. Cities that wanted rail or bus systems had to fund them almost entirely on their own. This created an enormous financial incentive. Build highways and Washington pays. Build transit and you're on your own. By the 1950s and 60s, the US government was spending 75% of transportation funding on roads and less than 1% on mass transit. It wasn't even close to a level playing field. This highway system crisscrossed through urban areas, in the process entirely destroying urban neighborhoods and entirely cutting off others. Without the interstate system being built, central city populations would have grown by about 8% on average, instead of declining by 17%. These cut-off areas morphed into suburbs. And if you think about it, the whole concept of a suburb is kinda crazy. They're entire neighborhoods, often without many amenities within walking distance, that are only accessible by car. Quite a shift from the bustling, community-oriented public spaces of traditional human settlements. This leads me to my next point: zoning. Most Americans have never read their city zoning code, but zoning is the single biggest reason why American cities feel the way they do. The dominant model is called Euclidean zoning, named after the 1926 Supreme Court case Village of Euclid v. Ambler Realty, which upheld the right of cities to strictly separate land uses by type. The core idea? Housing here, retail there. Offices somewhere else, industry far away. Roughly 97% of US municipalities utilize Euclidean zoning code. In practice, this means Americans often can't walk to a corner store because it's literally illegal to build one in their neighborhood. The cafe, the grocery store, the doctor's office are all zoned into commercial strips accessible only by car. On 75% or more of residential land in most major American cities, it's illegal to build anything other than a detached single-family home. No duplexes, no townhouses, no small apartment buildings, just houses with yards and driveways spread out at densities too low to support transit. And there's a reason for this. From 1934 to 1968, the Federal Housing Admission helped finance more than $120 billion in housing loans, and 98% of it went to white citizens. This heavily aided in white flight and made it dramatically easier to buy a new suburban home than to rent or buy in a city. The FHA had underwriting guidelines that actively penalized dense, mixed-use urban neighborhoods and favored new, low-density suburban developments. In Los Angeles alone, around 74% of all housing land is zoned exclusively for single-family homes. Now just compare this to Japan, where zoning is set nationally with just 12 categories, and the system is hierarchical. Each higher zone allows everything permitted in the lower ones. A small shop next to an apartment building isn't a special exception, it's the default. Tokyo, a dense city of over 10 million people, is among the most affordable major cities in the developed world partly because of this. So the federal government was simultaneously building highways to the suburbs and financing the houses at the end of them. Between 1950 and 1970, annual per capita transit trips in the US fell from 115.8 to 36.1. And then there's the parking situation. Some studies have estimated there's an insane 2 billion parking spots in the country. Every destination must make room for the car before it makes room for the person. There are between 3 to 8 parking spaces for every registered vehicle in the country. On average, in US cities with over 1 million people, 22% of land in the city center is used for parking. In Columbus, 27% of the central city is parking. Kansas City, 29%. Orlando, 33%. In downtown Tampa, it's also a third. And of their 24,000 parking spaces, a quarter of them were unused during peak hours. I also want you to pay attention to the fact that we're using different cities in every example, because it'd obviously be easy to dunk on the Southwest repeatedly, but the problem really is everywhere. Even schools, places built for children who legally can't drive, are designed around the car. In many cities like Charlotte and Dallas, parking minimums require high schools to dedicate nearly half their footprint to parking lots and drive aisles. In Copenhagen, children walk or bike to school from the age of 6. That's normal there. What all of this creates is a self-reinforcing trap. If homes are spread out, shops are far away. If shops are far away, people drive. If people drive, businesses build parking. If businesses build parking, everything spreads even farther apart. Once walking becomes impossible, transit loses riders. And finally, once transit loses riders, cities widen roads. Every part of the system props up every other part. And even when destinations aren't far, the streets themselves can make walking feel dangerous. A store can be 800 feet away and still feel impossible to reach on foot because the road between you and it was designed for cars moving at 45 miles an hour, let alone the fact there may not even be a sidewalk for you. every 4 years, the American Society of Civil Engineers publishes an annual report card assessment on the state of US transport infrastructure. In 2025, it scored the US a D in public transit. But hey, that's an improvement from the D- grade it received in 2021. The results of this can be seen everywhere. According to the 2024 US Census Bureau, 78.4% of people commute to work with a car, and just 3.7% use public transportation, with walking and bicycling even lower. Now I guess here is kind of where we talk about what should have been done to prevent all this. And well, I guess what should have been the solution goes back to the problem. Like I said before, in the early 20th century, almost all transit was privately owned, and they couldn't compete with all the subsidies the government gave in the form of road and highway construction. This was the grave mistake made, as the US should have pivoted toward public transportation here, like many European countries did. Remember, countries like Japan, France, the UK, all their systems actually started as private ventures too, but were nationalized by governments due to unprofitability and/or for integration. And even as many of these metro systems, like the Tokyo Metro, later became privatized in a public-private partnership way where the government maintains ownership of the infrastructure while private companies operate some of the train services, they didn't start out that way. That's the key difference. And even then, a lot of countries like China, South Korea, and Germany have their transit systems fully state-owned and/or operated by state-owned companies. Now, I'm not saying the US didn't do this. Public takeovers absolutely did happen in the US, from New York City to Chicago to even LA. Today, nearly every public transit system in the US is subsidized, but they ended up happening too late, like a rescue mission versus a modernization project. Then finances came into play, because public ownership doesn't automatically mean there's money there. In America, there's been a long-standing but honestly ridiculous debate about the profitability of public transit. For some reason, many Americans expect trains and buses to justify themselves by whether they turn a profit at the fare box. Yet highways are never judged that way. Nobody demands that an interchange recover its construction cost through tolls. And that's fair. The goal of transit shouldn't be profitability, but facilitating the movement of people, which in turn leads to economic activity. This would stimulate the economy more than money from ticket prices ever would. The US Postal Service and public libraries aren't profitable, but they're public services, which fundamentally means it exists to serve the public. That's how transit should be seen, but rather it's seen as a local welfare service for disadvantaged people, not as national infrastructure. Just about no European metros or entire transit systems for that matter are profitable. But it doesn't matter because these countries recognize the value of it. Transit agencies don't need profit to grow, they need investment to grow. Amtrak is actually a good example of that, with their record ridership of 34.5 million people in 2025, even if you don't think it's well run. That being said, I'm not saying that public transit justifies endless government expenditure either. I'm just saying that there shouldn't be an expectation of it being profitable. But there are technically ways to make it profitable. For example, in Asia, Hong Kong and Japan's railway systems are very profitable, largely due to their Rail Plus property model, where railway companies get to develop and manage the high-density real estate above and around the stations. If America's to revamp their transportation, then they need to see this completely differently. Many critics say the country is simply too big and not as dense as European or Asian countries for good public transportation to be feasible. But it really doesn't make sense. I mean, America was built with the railroad. Almost every city that exists today is because of the railroad. They actually have one of the best freight railroad systems in the world today. The US is large, but it shouldn't be compared to a European country, rather the contingent of Europe itself. Parts of the US, like the Northeast Corridor states, the Texas Triangle, the Rust Belt, or even just LA to San Francisco have similar population size, density, and distance to smaller European areas. Yet when you compare their transit options, the US mega areas still get blown out of the water. The size of the country doesn't actually matter when public transit is specifically operated in cities. The problem isn't that there is no high-speed rail through Wyoming. Things can improve though. It is possible. Many cities in Europe were becoming car-centric in the 60s, from Amsterdam to Copenhagen, but they were able to protest it, and it snowballed from there. Even in the present day, Paris has been doing radical infrastructure changes over the past 3 decades to become more walkable, by removing parking spots and converting streets into pedestrian zones. In the end, America's terrible design is as much of a transit problem as it is a zonal one. They go hand in hand. But realistically, will the US ever be able to implement anything like this? Will they ever be able to solve their infrastructure problems? I'm not sure, but what do you think? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more content like this. I'll see you in the next one.